Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today and joining us again if you're a returner. We're very pleased to see you all. This is the fourth of our seminars in the series on decolonising educational relationships. And in the first three seminars before the festive break, we covered some of the theoretical perspectives underpinning our work and identified a range of key issues associated with colonial and neoliberal education. If you weren't able to attend those seminars and are interested in viewing the recordings, they're available in our YouTube channel, and a link to that will be provided by Malcolm in the chat space. The next four seminars are setting out the imaginary that we have developed for decolonising educational relationships. And we're starting in this one with spirituality.
So I'm going to start with a narrative that I wrote last summer, a year after my mother passed away, and after a racist incident against a University of Regina student from India was reported in the local newspaper. So I'm going to read the story, and you can just sort of relax and listen to the story. That would be great. Close your eyes and imagine that against your skin you can feel a fabric that is gloriously soft and luxurious, at the same time satiny and soft, the likes that you've never had caressing your skin. The same fabric effortlessly embracing a multitude of patterns and designs embodied with rich, deep jewel colors, including those of rubies, amber, the deep greens of emeralds, and a multitude of colors that sapphires come in. In my mind's eye, I can still see a riot of colored fluid fabrics scattered across the crumpled duvet on my mother's bed. My mother's silk saris, these were. I inherited these when she passed away 2 years ago. It feels like I'm in outer space looking down at my mother's bed, delighting and appreciating the luminous and shimmering beauty of these silk saris, and at the same time feeling a depth of loss and sadness that reached the soles of my feet. Munjima, whose name is Zarina, wore her saris at minimum twice a week on Fridays and Sundays when she went to the Jamaat Khana, and Jamaat Khana is mosque, to pray. It hardly took her a minute or two to drape one of these on her slim body, but the rituals before putting on her sari took much more time. She would always take a sari out of her cupboard an hour before she had to leave home for the mosque, and she'd lay it on her bed. Then she would look for her matching slip and blouse that she would wear underneath the sari and lay these side by side next to her sari. She would then walk to her dresser where she kept her gold necklaces, tasbihs, bangles, earrings in small porcelain and leather-bound jewelry boxes. She would take these cases and go and sit in her chair next to the window, where she would take her time going through her jewelry to look for some of the pieces that she thought would match with her choice of sari. She would then lay all these carefully next to the clothing on her bed. Mujima would then walk to the kitchen, where she would take down a small orangey-colored clay dish the size of a saucer from the cupboard that held odd bits of china, vases, corningware, and candles that she kept for emergencies. She would heat this orangey-colored clay dish on the stove until it was piping hot, and would then take a small piece of coal and a few pieces of oud, which is the essential oil from the resin of the agar tree mixed with the attar of fragrant flowers, and place these on the clay dish to heat. She would stand at the stove waiting for the oud to both start melting and releasing its musky, scented attar of fragrant flowers. When the first waft of perfume was detected, she would carry this dish to the bedroom and she'd use this to perfume her sari, silken blouse. So, not to waste the oud, she'd open the doors to her cupboard gently and not too wide, as she didn't want this musky smell of the oud to escape. She passed the clay dish at, above, and under all her clothes that were hanging in there. Mujima and all her clothes always smelled of this ancient, Eastern, deep, musky, sensual smell of the attar of exotic flowers. Today, these saris hang in my cupboard and still have a faint scent of oud, bringing me close to her. Once in a while, on a Friday evening, I do wear one of her saris, and just like my mother did, I follow the same rituals she did before draping one on. When I follow Mujima's rituals and traditions that she passed down, I feel a sense of connectedness, of history, and a feeling of oneness in that I am from my mother, and she from her mother, and my grandmother from her mother, and so on. There's also a sense of belonging, a belonging to another time, space, and place. There's also a sense of deep sadness, as some of these traditions from the past may not have a place in the future. I am Fatma Kanu Shamsuddin Pirbhai Sundarji Samji Ladda Kurji Thoba Jasani Illich. Family oral narratives inform me that my family originates from an area called Kutch, situated in the northwest of Gujarat, India. During both the time of the German colonial rule in Tanganyika and during the period of the Busaidi Sultanate of Zanzibar, my forefathers migrated to the east coast of Africa to both escape British colonial rule and for a better way of life. My father's family settled in Dar es Salaam, Tanganyika, and my mother's in Georgetown, Zanzibar. For more than a century, my family had lived on the east coast of Africa, but as members of the Indian diaspora. In 1961, Tanganyika became independent, and in 1964, Tanganyika and Zanzibar united to form the United Republic of Tanzania. During this time, I learned that we were not welcome there for several reasons, even though it had been our family home for several generations. During the time of civil unrest, my mother and I immigrated to Canada. However, my grandfather and father stayed behind, and so the land and familial ties to Tanzania remained, albeit as an outsider looking in. In Canada, I quickly learned that my brown body and cultural ways of being and knowing were not welcome here either. Much later, I also learned that the welcome extended by the Canadian government was not theirs to give, that Canada was in fact Turtle Island and rightfully belonged to the First Nations. For almost 5 decades, I have lived in a land where I have been made to feel that I do not belong. The centrality of relations to land that is part of both Indigenous and white identities is not part of my identity. I have a sense of being a bystander to this way of thinking. It is not part of my schema because of the transient nature of diasporic relations to land. I have a longing for Tanzania and India as places where I might be and feel at home. But this longing is based on an imaginary, because I have never visited India and I have only returned to Tanzania once since we left. Home as a relation to land is always temporary to me because a return to home is an eternal impossibility, while a reframing of home is a continuous negotiation. My home is a diasporic space of in-betweenness, a space without land, the ethereal connections to home, where home is the steadfast emotional connections to the heart of my mother, the intermingling of our blood and bloodlines, our mutual connections to the spiritual realm, and our pursuit of the intellectual mind. Munjima, you are my land, you are my place, and you are my home.
In this slide, we're just very briefly going to distinguish between how we're understanding religion and spirituality. And while there is obvious overlap between the two, it's possible to be spiritual without adhering to a particular religion, and also to be religious without being what some might consider to be deeply spiritual. And our purpose here is to say that we are specifically focusing on spirituality in its broadest sense, viewing it as a dimension to all educational relationships and not confined to what in the UK is known as religious education. So we view spirituality as being concerned with what some might call the soul or the spirit. So soul questions might be, who am I? What is my purpose? What is the meaning of life? And we view religion as a personal set or institutionalized system of religious attitudes, beliefs, and practices, and including the service and worship of God or the supernatural. Spirituality is an experience of connecting to something larger than you, living everyday life in a reverent and sacred manner, and it's the aspect of humanities that refers to the way people seek and express meaning and purpose, and the way they experience their connectedness to the moment, to self, to others, to nature, and to the significant or sacred. And just to reinforce our focus here, we look at the place of religious education in schools and argue that religious education can, but does not necessarily ensure a spiritual dimension. So, for example, religious education in Saskatchewan, which is the province in Canada that Fatima works in, because each province has its own curriculum. There's not a national curriculum in Canada. In Saskatchewan, there is a public school system that is secular, and there is no provision of religious education in the public school system. But there are also Catholic school boards for Catholic schools and independent faith schools, such as Islamic schools, where there clearly would be a form of religious education. In England, and I'm identifying England here as being having a different context than Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland, there is a national statutory duty to provide a religious education in state schools. And at each county level, this is then translated into an agreed syllabus. And just in case there are those of you who are not sure what that includes, the expectation within the agreed syllabus is that there can be a selection at different key stages from the 6 major faiths, and that part of what is expected is that this education would help students to learn about and learn from different religions. However, as we've said, inclusion of religious education doesn't necessarily ensure a critical spiritual perspective. For example, it might be perfectly possible to teach the curriculum from the agreed syllabus in a way which held dangers of essentialism and exoticization, which reinforces otherness. And we've already mentioned that in some of our previous seminars, and we're going to go on to say some more in this one.
So in this slide, we talk about how we came to the inclusion of the spiritual dimension that we that emerged from our own personal experiences, and how we used these to theorize how it could be used in education. And the content from this slide comes directly from Fran's and my experience with spirituality. Although we come to this from different parts, we have many areas of convergence. I was brought up in a faith-based tradition of spirituality, where we learned from childhood that we are all interconnected, interrelated, and that we were interdependent to the people on this earth, those beyond the human and the materiality around us, that we had an equal ethical responsibility to these aspects, and the sense of generosity that goes along with the three ways of thinking about being in the world. That's the interconnectedness, interrelatedness, and the interdependence. We also invoke our ancestral spirits and souls to bless us in our daily lives and to keep an eye over us and to guide us. And through daily meditation, we attempt to achieve a spiritual connection with God or a spirit to become one with. However, we understand that meditation alone cannot achieve this. We have to remember and act in accordance with our understandings of interconnectedness, interrelatedness, and interdependence on the one hand, and our duty to achieving this oneness with God and or spirit, and our responsibilities in the world. Both have equal weightage. Spirituality, therefore, cannot exist in my worldview without a critical understanding of the different forms of relationality, what it means to be spiritual, human, and humane, and that these cannot be separated into distinct categories of mind and spirit. And I was thinking here of the Cartesian spirit. In other words, it is integral, and it is part of my identity. Both the esoteric and the exoteric are not separable. Fran comes to spirituality from her ethical relationship in and with the world and the beings around her, and her understandings of plural knowledges. Although brought up in the tradition of the Cartesian split of mind and body, which included being brought up as a Christian, Fran left the church in her early 20s due to the disillusionment with what she perceived to be the dogma of the Christian faith. Perhaps because of her experiences as a farmer's daughter, intimately connected to the land and all living beings, Fran comes to spirituality in her ways of being, feeling, viewing, and doing in the world, where she connects with land, spirit, soul, energy across time and space. In both our instances, although differently, spirituality is embodied in the way that we ethically practice our lives, in our ways of thinking, viewing, and doing the world. It is about our practice and unconditional generosity, our understanding and acceptance of plural knowledges in the world. It is a holistic understanding of what it means to be generous of spirit, of intellect and knowledge, and what it means to be human and humane.
Okay, so we're now going to return to the issue of coloniality, which underpins so much of what we're talking about, and from which we're moving into thinking about decoloniality. And in this, we're drawing on the framework outlined in the film The Uprising, which you can find on YouTube, where they outline a framework for revealing the narrative of colonialism that is built on lies. And this framework, on the left-hand side in the column, you can see the lies of coloniality, which are seen in the terms that are used, in the selection of facts, in the narratives that are created around those terms and selection of facts, in the greater theory, and in the erasure of ethics. And Edward Said, in his seminal work on Orientalism, made a distinction between colonialism, which was founded on Christian theological thought and created racialized hierarchies, and modern Orientalism, which happened following the Enlightenment, that he describes as a set of structures inherited from the past, but structures that have been secularized, rationalized, and given scientific terminology. And he describes it as secular because of the split between the church and the state that took place at that time. And for Said, the overall narrative of modern Orientalism positioned colonized peoples as uncivilized, as savage, whose spiritual traditions were viewed as primitive or backward or superstitions. And even European pagan forms of spirituality were similarly framed within this narrative because they were perceived as an earlier form of development that had been left behind. So from a Western Christian perspective, if people are savage, they can't be religious or godly. and therefore they are less than human. And in this framing, the spirituality of the other is exoticized and put in opposition with religion. So if we then go to have a look at each of those elements of the lies of coloniality, we can see that the terms that have been used by the colonizers, instead of saying that something is spiritual or bodily violence, which is how it will be felt by the colonized, it's positioned by the colonizers as saviorism or a civilizing mission. And colonizing to control minds through coercive habits is viewed as conversion to Christianity. Enslavers are positioned as saviors, conversion is positioned as a service or charity, and so on. And then the narrative of lies that is created around this, that gives those things a positive framing, such as saving the hearts and minds of those who are godless or superstitious. More recently, in contemporary times, Islamophobia being described as a war on terror. And in the early times, the Bible as the religious canon would be provided as a religious authority for these ways of framings. And then post-Enlightenment, it would be the use of scientific rationality or an intellectual authority. And the greater or grand theory that is created around all of this, following the Enlightenment and the rise of civilization and secularism, is modernity, and then from modernity, neoliberalism. And we argue that there is an erasure of ethics in all of this, because the way in which the mind, body, spirit split, which is the result of colonization, where rationality becomes dominant, Christianity is viewed as the religion of the civilized world, where others are viewed as heathen peoples and positioned as being civilized by the colonizers. And we've outlined this because clearly we need to understand the history behind coloniality and how it relates to spirituality in order then to move on to thinking about how we might decolonize these ways of thinking and being. And this isn't just history, though. This is something that affects us in the contemporary era as well. And I'm just going to outline a couple of examples here stemming from my own experience as the leader of some study visits and also a researcher spending time in the Gambia in West Africa in 2009 and 2010. And on the left-hand side here, we've got an example of a Christian-based foundation called the Don McMouth Foundation, who was sending flyers out to tourists, European tourists in that area, trying to get them to sponsor children for £60 a year. And a direct quote from the flyer is, "The Gambia in West Africa is one of the smallest and poorest of African countries, which relies on peanuts and tourism for its income. There is no free education in the Gambia. Our aim is to give children from the poorest Gambian families an education." And on the right-hand side is some information that reveals some of the lies that lie behind that flyer. So, for example, in 2010, tourism did account for 17.2% of the gross domestic product of the country. However, this represented $1 in every $10 that tourism generated, the other $9 going to overseas to the travel companies and their partners, whose employees are mostly European, and to the European companies from whom fresh fruit and vegetables were imported to the Gambia to serve the tourist hotels. In addition to this, at that time, public school education was free at primary level. Primary school pupils or their parents did have to pay for some things like books and uniform, but otherwise it was free. And it was subsidized by the World Bank for girls at secondary level up to the age of 14. In another example, Christian-based charitable foundations, it's almost an industry that exists to support the education of Gambian students, and it's always positioned as enabling them to rise out of poverty. But there are many hidden effects of this. For example, the private schools funded by European foundations are divisive because they create inequities in teachers' pay between those schools and the state schools. They create inequities in access to the schools, and they offer a Eurocentric Christian-based curriculum in a predominantly Muslim country. 95% of the population in the Gambia is Muslim. And I'm now just going to read to you Nene's story. And Nene is a friend who I was staying with at the time. Nene told me at breakfast, this is an excerpt from my diary that I was keeping while I was there. Nene told me at breakfast that her son, who was 5 years old, was sent back from school this morning because the Belgian sponsors had come to visit. They are a Christian organisation, and once a year they visit to see how the school is progressing and to give gifts of books and pens to the children. However, they only give the gifts to the children who have a sponsor, so all the other children were sent home to avoid embarrassment on behalf of the Belgians. Later that week, the Belgians' visit was reported on local radio, and the leader of the group was heard saying, "We are here to help the poorest of the poor." Nene asked me what that meant and was very upset when I explained it to her, as she does not consider her family to be the poorest of the poor. So both Nene and her son were learning at that time of the continuing contemporary effects of colonial ways of thinking. Voluntourism, which I guess this could be held under that umbrella of voluntourism, may be fueled by noble feelings, but it's built on perverse economics. And this is from an article in The Guardian in 2018. Many organisations offer volunteers the chance to dig wells, build schools, and do other construction projects in poor villages. It's easy to understand why it's done this way. If a charity hires locals for its unskilled work, it would be spending money. If it uses volunteers who pay to be there, it's raising money.
Okay, so in this slide, we return to the framework that Fran used earlier, but we've changed the terms in the left-hand column to reflect a decolonial perspective. So you can see here, when we take a look at the terminology, we start looking at non-binary and post-oppositional language, where spirituality is both relational and esoteric, connecting the two through our material life experiences and our experiences of spirituality, interconnectedness, interrelatedness, and interdependence. And it's almost a critical relationality and a spirituality combined, where we see that lies become truth, selective facts become plurality, the narrative of lies becomes counter narratives, the grand theory becomes theories, the erasure of ethics become ethics. Bhattacharya in 2018 argues that a decolonial agenda is inherently an agenda of spiritual activism, in that it allows one to imagine and even travel to other worlds of possibility where all of us are free. Anzaldúa and Keating demonstrate how imagination's soul dimension bridges body and the nature of spirit and mind, making these connections in the in-between space of Nepantla. Through Nepantla, one acquires additional, potentially transformative perspectives, different ways to understand ourselves, our circumstances, and our worlds. It's as if Nepantla shoves us partially outside of our previously comfortable frameworks, pushes us into frictional contradictory clash of worldviews, and challenges us to make some sort of meaning from chaos, and thus forces us to change. we move on to the next slide? Thank you. So spirituality is therefore responsive to multiple wisdom traditions in our ways of thinking, which may or may not be constructed as religion. It is a way of being based on the belief in the existence of things outside the body, that is, outside the experiencing and cognitive knowing of material reality. In this respect, it is a way of knowing that is embodied in affective, that expands perception and awareness. It is a philosophy, a worldview, a perspective, and a perception. Some call it an energy source, and it expands expansion to become conscious even in sleep and to become aware of the interconnections between all things by attaining a grand or holistic perspective. Because spirituality can be conceived of as an all-encompassing energy, even a moment or a glimpse of such an energy would perhaps reveal the interconnectedness of all beings and things in the universe, including ourselves, bringing us into harmony with the world and diminishing feelings of isolation, loneliness, and disconnection. And I'm going to add marginalization. Spirituality, therefore, is about connecting with and across multiple ways of viewing, being, and doing. It doesn't reject the wisdom of Euro-Western thought, but sees it as one form of wisdom among many. It requires living with contradictions, suspending rational sense-making and using intuition. It comes through the sense of being with rather than doing to. It can come through connection with nature, through music, reading, discovering new approaches to problems. It combines fact, fiction, dreams, desires, visions, and meditative insights. As an ethical relation, spiritual connections in the classroom would involve noticing, seeing, and connecting with each and every student and all their relations and relationships, all their ways of being, including those that are spiritual.
What we're going to do here is think about the effect of coloniality and colonial education on social and spiritual identities. And coloniality has an alienating effect, as this has been expressed by authors and scholars such as Gloria Anzaldúa, both on her own and together with Anna Louise Keating, and expressed as the fractured self. For example, they argue that coloniality leads to an extreme hyper-individualized realism in which all objects, including human beings, are ultimately independent and separated or withdrawn from all others. Colonization therefore creates a fractured self. Its wounds can be physical, psychic, cultural, and spiritual. And Anzaldúa, like Said, emphasizes the role of language. Her view is that language, the physical world, the imaginal, and non-ordinary realities are all intimately interwoven. Words and images matter and are matter. They can have causal materializing forces. Hence the words that we outlined in the colonial narrative of lies have a materializing force. And then Kakali Bhattacharya, in the context of working in higher education as a transnational scholar of colour, experiences the coloniality of the system in higher education as spirit draining, and shows how becoming aware of other ways of being and doing in her praxis helped her to reject the labels that had been ascribed to her. Lenny Strobel, a Filipina scholar living and working in the academy in the United States, describes how for her, the Cartesian split between mind and body was also a spirit-body split, a consequence of which was emotional distancing and a disconnection from her authentic self. And educationally, this alienating effect is also seen. For example, education is within a colonial system a state-organized narrative that is coercive, that creates a forced forgetting or amnesia of alternative onto-epistemologies, and this perpetuates the spirit-mind-body split. So those marked as other have to constantly perform different versions of themselves in order to fit in, which can create an inner dualism. Within this system, there's an emphasis on the ego, a westernized version of self-actualization, of individuality and competition. And in such a system, not succeeding is equated with failure rather than a point of growth, while success is monitored by regimes of accountability requiring commodification, standardization, and objectification. And in 2019, an article in The Conversation described England's education system as being in crisis, citing teacher shortages, teachers describing their work as meaningless because they were reduced to capturing metrics rather than supporting learning, and that in the school sector, this was leading to some dodgy practices in a bid to boost rankings, for example, by informal or managed exclusions of poorly performing pupils, who were often children with special educational needs. And in this slide, we're showing using a source of the elective home education, who conducted a survey in 2019 of schools and parents' choices to home educate their children. And this was because since 2014, up until the figures that we have for 2019, there's been between a 30 to a 40% rise in children being taken out of the state sector to be homeschooled year on year. And for 2019, we can see that the demographics show that key stages 2, 3, and 4 are the ones in which the largest number of students are now being homeschooled, with much smaller numbers in early years, key stage 1 and key stage 5. There's very little difference between boys and girls, but approximately 30% of the children withdrawn to be homeschooled were already known to children's services. And in the report, the reasons given were philosophical or lifestyle choice being the most common reason and cited 70 times, health and emotional reasons cited 56 times, and general dissatisfaction with the school cited 55 times. But of those three, health and emotional reasons were the ones that were rising or increasing most swiftly from year to year.
So our rationale for bringing a spiritual dimension into education is therefore that we know that the system is sick, an example of which we presented on the previous slide, to which we could add the increasing numbers of teachers wanting to leave the profession and the alarming rise in mental health issues in higher education. We've put this down to the colonial neoliberalization of education and its regimes of accountability, as well as to the forms of coercive relationships that such a system demands. Coloniality is based on a logic of separation that has created fractured selves from the system and for education and society. And we believe that a spiritual or soulful dimension is a healing element that is crucial to the process of decolonization. To be clear, including a spiritual dimension in education is not for us about spiritual development, which may be associated with linear stages of development, but rather about spiritual growth. As Judy Isake says, spirituality's strength is a life force which aids the decolonization of the mind in the school system, and not attending to the spirit would make decolonizing work incomplete. Through spirituality, you can then be a subject of change rather than an object of change. So in this slide, we summarize how we conceptualize a spiritual dimension. And in the final slide, we apply this to decolonizing educational relationships. And so you can see here we're trying to continually to start thinking about how to heal and how to be, how to try to get ourselves to think of being interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent with one another, and how attending to this from a holistic way, where we use generosity, heart, and love can change the ways we do education. So, a spiritual, soulful dimension to educational relationships would require all educators to develop their own understanding of spirituality and thus the interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent nature of life, not for self improvement or for self advancement through appropriation, but for understanding how to work in different ways to establish nurturing relationships, particularly with those who are being marginalized and failed by the system. Such understandings would enable educators to establish a different form of relationship with colleagues, students, and between students. They would be able to establish a different form of collective relationship and a sense of community in and beyond the confines of the classroom, school, or college. And they would be able to attend to the spirit or soul as well as to the mind and heart in establishing that sense of connection and belonging. This is what some might describe as a pedagogy of love and generosity, and we begin to explore this in our next seminar.